I'm really excited about our program today and very pleased to announce our speaker who is with us. He is Colin P. Clarke, and he's the executive director of the Soufan Center, where his research focuses on transnational terrorism, geopolitics, and international security. Colin has previously served as the director of research at the Soufan Center and a senior research fellow there. Prior to those roles, he was a professor at Carnegie Mellon University and spent a decade working as a political scientist at the Rand Corporation. He's the author or co-author of 5 books, appears frequently in the media, and publishes regularly in the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, and other outlets. He's testified before Congress on numerous occasions and often consults with the United States government. He also serves on the editorial board of leading scholarly journals in the field of terrorism studies, studies in conflict and terrorism and political violence. Colin received his master's degree from NYU Center for Global Affairs and his doctorate from the University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. We're delighted to have you with us, Colin. Thank you so much, and we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, and thanks so much for having me, albeit virtually. I do very much appreciate everyone coming out to listen to what I think is a fascinating topic in the future of terrorism. So without further ado, I'll jump right in. I'll work through the slides, and I always find that the Q&A session is among the most enriching. And so I'm just going to jump in. So the bottom line up front, which is something we use in the kind of security consulting realm, which is something that you'll see in the intelligence community, is just the kind of main points. What's the overview here? And one is that the threat posed by terrorists and violent extremists is more diverse than at any time in recent memory. When we talked about the global war on terrorism, we were largely talking about a war on a specific type of terrorism, Sunni jihadism. But now, as you'll see when I go through the slides, the threat is far more diverse and coming from many different more angles. Religiously motivated terrorists, particularly jihadists, still pose a formidable challenge to Western counterterrorism efforts. Look no further than the arrests over Halloween just this last week of young American men in Washington State, Michigan, and New Jersey, all implicated in an ISIS-inspired plot. I was actually on CNN last night talking to John Miller on Anderson Cooper's show about this plot, which was quite serious. But the threat landscape also includes violent conspiracy theorists, so-called incels, and if that's a new term for folks, I'll explain later on in the briefing. It stands for involuntarily celibate. It's basically violent misogynists, primarily but not exclusively men. Eco-fascists, anti-government or anti-authority violent extremists. This is a group that kind of largely falls in the far right, where you have militias like the Three Percenters, Oath Keepers, and others, sovereign citizens, but also violent left-wing anarchists. White supremacists and neo-Nazis, animal rights and environmental violent extremists, abortion-related violent extremists, both pro-life and pro-choice, so-called salad bar terrorists, who are a largely newer phenomenon. That's a phrase coined by former FBI Director Christopher Wray, talking about how people kind of pick and choose different strands of ideology online that then serve as grievances to motivate them to conduct attacks. And then neo-Luddites are those with an aversion to technology. And we're seeing more and more of that with the creeping ubiquity of artificial intelligence, robotics, and other emerging technologies. This kind of pushback against that. With the global war on terrorism, the United States reacted to the deadliest attack on our soil, with nearly 3,000 citizens killed. I was a college senior the day that happened, studying abroad in Galway, Ireland at the time. I went to Loyola University in Baltimore, a small Jesuit school, for my undergrad, and had been spending the semester in Ireland to study the aftermath of the Good Friday Agreement, which was forged in 1998. So I was already interested in studying terrorism and political violence, but after 9/11, I became obsessed with kind of South Asia, Pakistan, Salafi jihadism, and that led me to embark on the career that I've had for the last 2 decades. Um, but with that, we built this large architecture of counterterrorism all over the world. And to this day, no country is better than finding and eliminating terrorists than the United States. We also made many missteps in the GWAT, the poorly named GWAT. I always thought it was a misnomer to call it the global war on terrorism because terrorism is a tactic. And so you can't defeat a tactic, right? That would have been like in Blitzkrieg, instead of declaring war on the Axis powers in World War II, declaring war on, war on Blitzkrieg, right? Like a tactic. It makes no sense. We should have declared war on Al Qaeda, um, and that would have at least affixed a finite end date to this conflict. Um, in the meantime, because we were so narrowly focused on Al Qaeda, the Islamic State and their various affiliates, we missed other threats on the horizon, arguably including what happened on October 7th. Even though that struck Israel, it still had global ramifications. And we hadn't really been watching groups like Hamas, groups like Hezbollah, groups like the Houthis, and others. Other current hotspots include sub-Saharan Africa, which is now arguably the epicenter in terms of lethality of jihadist terrorism, the Horn of Africa, Central and Southeast Africa, South and Central Asia. So there's still a lot of hotspots throughout the world. Um, and while I think there was a correction needed because we were spending so much money, bandwidth, resources, energy on counterterrorism, I think what we've seen since is arguably an overcorrection. We've now wiped out budgets. We've riffed, which is a reduction in force. A lot of the personnel focused on this topic, both in government and in the private sector and in think tanks. And I'm very concerned that we're becoming more vulnerable to an attack. And if something does occur, that we won't have the deep bench needed to deal with the aftermath. And we can get into, why I've written about what I call counterterrorism fatigue, which has kind of shifted our focus to things like great power competition, strategic competition, namely with China, artificial intelligence, critical minerals, all things that are important. As someone that studies terrorism, I've never argued that terrorism is existential. I think there's a lot of other important threats out there. But to go and neglect counterterrorism, I think is dangerous, both domestically and abroad. I mentioned just earlier that Africa has been the center of gravity, and we've seen the Sahel. And for those that don't know, the Sahel, that's a portion of sub-Saharan Africa, just below North Africa, situated in kind of North and West Africa. Think about if you've seen what's happening right now in Mali, where an Al-Qaeda linked group, Jamaat, excuse me, Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin, otherwise known as JNIM, is on the verge of overtaking Bamako, the capital of Mali, and has its tentacles spreading throughout countries like Burkina Faso, Niger, and elsewhere. You've also got various Islamic State affiliates, including the Islamic State Sahel province and the Islamic State West Africa province, that continue to operate in these areas. These groups are now proficient using drone technology. Um, and part of the pushback I get is, so what? If these groups are active in Africa, what effect does it have on us in the United States? Essentially, who cares? Um, but I would point to Afghanistan as, a similar example in the lead up to 9/11. Before the attacks of September 11, 2001, many people had the same argument. Who cares about this landlocked country in Central Asia? If it's a mess, that doesn't impact the United States. But we learned that we're only as strong as our weakest link, even as we've done a great job in making strides to protect the homeland. Again, the Sahel is seen as a string of successive military coups, but it's also opened the door to Russian influence. That's come in the form of the Wagner Group, also known as Africa Corps. I gave a talk to the World Affairs Council, Los Angeles and Orange County. I think it was 2 summers ago, shortly after Yevgeny Prigozhin had launched his failed or aborted coup, the so-called March on Moscow. Incidentally, I've got a book on the Wagner Group coming out next year, early next year in the spring, through Columbia University Press, along with two other scholars. where we look at the kind of rise and fall of this group, but also look ahead to what it means for other countries, including China, including Turkey, including potentially India and others that are ramping up interest in using private military contractors, or to use a more pejorative term, mercenaries. I wrote a piece, at the Sufan Center this year in September, in the lead up to 9/11, to the anniversary, we held our second annual Global Summit on Terrorism and Political Violence right at Ground Zero. And accompanying that, I wrote an article along with one of my colleagues looking at the current state of Al Qaeda. We published that in the Combating Terrorism Center Sentinel, the CTC Sentinel, which is published out of West Point. And again, we focused a lot on, this is a largely African phenomenon at the time, not exclusively. Somalia, with Al-Shabaab, JNIM in the Sahel and others have expanded their operations and really given Al-Qaeda some momentum. Um, Other counterterrorism analysts, including folks that I respect a lot, like Dan Byman, who's a professor at Georgetown, um, are a bit more optimistic in this group's decline. And Dan said the organization's decline in both capabilities and ideological influence is what he talked about. Myself, I'm not ready to write that obituary. I think we underestimate these groups at our own peril. Um, and so, while we can acknowledge that these groups have been significantly weakened, I think it's critically important to stay on the offensive, to remain proactive. I'm concerned about Afghanistan becoming somewhat of an intelligence black hole. Since we withdrew and the country collapsed, was taken over by the Taliban in August 2021, we have virtually no human intelligence in that country, and we rely, and I would argue we over rely on what's called SIGINT, or signals intelligence, to prevent attacks. We've also got Al Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent and TTP, Tehrik-e-Taliban. That may be a group you've heard of more recently. They're waging an ongoing war against the Pakistani state. The past week has been interesting. We've seen a car bomb in Delhi, followed by a bombing in Islamabad, in Pakistan's capital. And what's so dangerous about India and Pakistan going tit for tat with terrorist attacks? Well, they both have nuclear weapons, and I would argue that that's one of the most dangerous scenarios that we face globally, is these two countries coming to near blows on multiple occasions, as they did, I think, as recently as April after an attack in Kashmir. For my money, that's something that is probably understudied, this kind of ongoing back and forth between those two countries. And if you think about the history there, partition in 1947, then wars in 1965, 1971, another close call in 1999. This is what some would argue is a black swan, right? So a fairly uh, unlikely event, but if it does occur, it's got outsized implications. As my good friend and colleague Asfan Yarmir notes, Pakistan faces an increasingly formidable threat from the insurgency of the TTP. And again, we saw a suicide bombing in Islamabad this week, claimed by a TTP kind of subgroup or front group. And if the Pakistani armed forces are unable to quell the insurgency, we could see widespread instability, plunging this country back into chaos as jihadists threaten a nuclear armed state. When I was doing my PhD studies at Pitt, I was following the kind of blow by blow daily in what was happening in Pakistan for years. Just to give you a sense, this is like 2008 to 2012 timeframe, and I can tell you there was something happening almost every day. Very dangerous part of the world. When it comes to the Islamic State, I've done a lot of work, including my time at RAND, on ISIS financing, and I know that was included in the title of this. Um, there's not a lot to talk about current day because this is a group that's largely operating in the shadows. But I can tell you, based on my unclassified work, some of the most interesting work I ever did was on the classified side, which obviously I can't talk about, on ISIS financing, on how this group raised money. But there's plenty to talk about in the open source. And this was a group that was making millions of dollars a day at its peak, including through the sale of oil and oil derivatives, kidnapping for ransom, all sorts of human trafficking and smuggling, extortion, mafia style activities. If there was a way to make money from it, they were doing it. And so, even though the United States and its coalition allies has made great strides in reducing the Islamic State's access to resources, um, terrorism is not that expensive, right? And so there's a really big return on investment here. I would I would suggest that they have more than enough money for a rainy day to continue funding this insurgency at a low level, and even potentially building it back up. Now, I don't think we're ever going to see, uh, the point where we did, where this group ran essentially a caliphate that was the equivalent of the size of Great Britain and had tens of thousands of people under its control. We're not going to get back to that. I surely hope, and I don't think. But even if it's something on a smaller scale, it can be quite disruptive. Syria, as many of you know, is going through a political transition. We just had Ahmed al-Shara. I mean, amazing scenes to see the former leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria in the White House. That's definitely a day I never thought I would see. I can tell you that much. Um, and a lot of people are hopeful that this is a person that actually is capable of leading Syria through a peaceful transition. I still have my own reservations about this. He certainly seems to be talking the talk, walking the walk. He's well polished. I always joke he got the McKinsey makeover. Um, he definitely has better suits than I do, and a better stylist. So, but is this somebody that we can trust? Is this somebody that's capable of leading Syria to stability after all many, many years of uh, rule by the Assad regime? And one of the announcements that was made at the White House was that um, Syria would be joining the anti-ISIS coalition, so working with the United States, presumably gleaning intelligence from the United States with limitations uh, to help combat this group. ISIS-K, that might be a name that you've heard before. This is the group's imprint in Afghanistan, is, for my money, probably the group we should be most concerned about. If there's going to be an attack on U.S. soil, this is one of the groups that has the intent and the capability to do that. They've, in 2024, conducted large-scale attacks in Iran, Russia, a smaller attack in Turkey. They also had plots foiled in Austria, Germany, France against the Paris Olympics. This is a group that I say goes for big game hunting, right? They're swinging for the fences. And if they get just one of those attacks through, it's going to be quite devastating. The Austria plot, for example, was targeting a Taylor Swift concert. If you remember, that was in August of 2024. Incidentally, it was also, I have two daughters, 7 and 9 years old. Probably the only time that I could remember them thinking I was somewhat cool, because I was on CNN split screen with a video of Taylor Swift singing and me here talking about it, and they thought that was cool. So I've probably peaked in that sense. It's all downhill from there. Southeast Asia, which at one point was home to a fairly robust ISIS network, has been more quiet, but we are starting to see signs that operational tempo is increasing. The same goes for ISIS affiliates in Somalia, Yemen, Libya, and Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, which have been struggling to regain momentum. But for terrorists and insurgents, they win simply by not losing in many ways. And then I think, October 7th also showed us the danger of a return to state-sponsored terrorism. The Iranian axis of resistance, which includes groups like Hamas, Lebanese Hezbollah, Palestine Islamic Jihad, the Houthis, and various Iraqi Shia militia groups, including Kataib Hezbollah. That was the group responsible for kidnapping Elizabeth Surkov, who was a doctoral student at Princeton and someone I know. Um, so all sorts of kind of various violent non-state actors to be concerned about that receive funding and training and equipment from nation states. I'd say Iran is and has been the leading state sponsor of terrorism for some time. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we've seen an increase in the use of mercenaries and private military contractors, as well as an uptick in assassinations and assassination attempts on politicians and several heads of state. Uh, what happens next is anybody's guess. I wrote a piece in the New York Times in July after the United States joined the fray and attacked Iran's nuclear program about what we could see next. And one of my concerns is that um, Iran figured out what happened when it took on the Israelis in terms of conventional warfare, right? Stood no match, can't compete. So, what lesson does Iran draw from that? Most likely, it's going to be to take their resources and to invest them into asymmetric means, whether that's cyber, um, whether that's insurgency, or whether that's just a return to their comparative advantage, which is traditional acts of terrorism. Uh, Iran was behind the Islamic Jihad bombing of the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut in 1983, and then many acts of terrorism since then, globally, all over the world, including in Argentina against Jewish and Israeli targets, attacks in Bulgaria through Hezbollah, and a lot of plotting on U.S. soil. They're paying close attention and engaging in various acts of reconnaissance, scouting targets. We know that, and that's a future vulnerability as well. This is a country that has a long memory. At the same time, we've got a threat from both the far left and the far right. Under the far right umbrella, far white supremacists, neo-Nazis. Um, in 2018, white supremacists killed 3 times as many Americans as jihadists did. We've seen numerous high-profile attacks here, including in El Paso, Texas, at a Walmart targeting immigrants, at a supermarket in Buffalo, New York, targeting African Americans, and where I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, at the Tree of Life in October 2018. I was actually living in Squirrel Hill, that neighborhood at the time, when Robert Bowers attacked the synagogue and killed a number of worshipers. So we see a continued threat from white supremacy. We've seen foreign fighters leave the United States and go to Ukraine to fight on both sides. And there are concerns about what happens to those individuals if and when they attempt to return home. There's other groups, including the Russian Imperial Movement, Atomwaffen, the Base, and many other kind of smaller neo-Nazi, white supremacist, and accelerationist groups. This was something that really ramped up during COVID, QAnon, and all these other violent extremists. And here is where the kind of salad bar comes into play. These are people that have been swept up and unfortunately lack real digital literacy to know what's real and what's not. And many of these people during COVID kind of flocked to this strange conspiracy, which produced real world violence. If you look at the Pizzagate incident and a number of other incidents as well, the FBI labeled conspiracy-driven domestic extremists as a domestic terrorism concern. QAnon has largely faded, but I would expect that some of these conspiracies live on and kind of take other forms as well. We also know that some U.S. adversaries, China, Russia, Iran, and others, have amplified these conspiracies online. 5G and the potential for neo-Luddite terrorism. Here we have another kind of overlap with conspiracists. It's not just relegated to the United States. We've seen this abroad. There's this new growing movement that's kind of resurrected Ted Kaczynski, if you remember him, the Unabomber. And there's traces of neo-Luddite ideology in his writings. I'll be honest with you, I actually went back recently and reread his manifesto, and it's uncanny how much he predicted, frankly. If you think about the world we live in with cell phones and everything, and he was a bit ahead of his time in predicting this, and that's why I think it resonates with a lot of folks. Now, he went a step further and crossed the line into illegality by engaging in acts of terrorism and mail bombings. That's the way that he dealt with this grievance. So you could have kind of the right ideas and the wrong approach. But again, the fact that his writings have become more mainstream in recent memory is concerning for a number of reasons. Sorry, just to go back to this for a second. That third bullet, as AI becomes more ubiquitous and concern grows over robotics as a source of job loss, it could push individuals to engage in acts of violence to push back against what they see as this encroachment or overreach of technology. That's something we're seeing almost every day online with people kind of voicing violent threats. I would say for those that are interested, the Sufon Center, which is the organization I'm the executive director of, every day, Monday through Friday, we put out what's called a daily intel brief. So if you go to the site and you sign up, it's free of charge. We're a nonprofit, and our one of our missions is to educate the broader public. You'll have delivered into your inbox at 3 a.m. Eastern Time an intel brief on a different topic. We wrote about this last week. One of my colleagues who's based in Europe kind of doing various online surveying to see what people thought about this. And you'll see some of that as well. Incels or involuntary celibates, these are individuals who advocate violence against women. Um, we saw Canada taking the unprecedented step of charging a teenager with terrorism for an incel-inspired attack at a Toronto massage parlor. It's a very complex ideology. Some people argue it's not terrorism at all. Um, Tends to mostly gravitate toward far right extremes online. And there's a regular self-identification with autism or Asperger's among this population in particular. I think, and this is something I've been talking about for several years, we're poised for a growth in left-wing violence. And a lot of times this is a result of what we call reciprocal radicalization. As the right grows more threatening, the left will as well. There's a big debate over Antifa, whether that is a terrorist group, whether it should be classified as a terrorist group. I've been very public in kind of my thoughts on that. And then we're seeing, a big push in anti-capitalism and a backlash against corporations. Think about Luigi Mangione assassinating the CEO of Highmark or of United Healthcare last year. And online, he was celebrated and lauded and actually has quite a big cult following, if that gives you any sense of how particularly younger generations thought of that act. We're probably going to see more of that. Um, Austerity measures that could increase an uptick in left-wing violence. Uh, and then there's this perception that urban areas are hospitable to anarchists, which could fuel further growth. With the president sending the National Guard into some of these neighborhoods, that's going to lead to an uptick in left-wing violence as well. Um, and we can't rule out the possibility that some of these groups will establish links abroad with other left-wing groups. Although there, if you look at Latin America, the groups are very focused on climate, and so there's some kind of regional or geographic variation when we talk about this. Fringe fluidity is an interesting concept. It's essentially the ability of some people to reconcile aspects of two competing ideologies. Um, so these are people that are obsessed with the Nazis and Al Qaeda, right? Which on its face are kind of two different things. They see no problem in kind of picking and choosing. Again, it goes along with the salad bar ideologies that span the political and ideological spectrum. Um, and the overlap of concepts that motivate these individuals and groups to engage in violence makes it more difficult to identify and thus to counter what the appropriate response is. I have conversations with folks in law enforcement sometimes that have never even heard of, uh, you know, certain websites that we're tracking, right? Ecofascism is an interesting concept. We call it white supremacists going green. So this is folks on the far right that are championing a typical far left concern, which is protecting the climate. And so they are all about protecting the earth, but mostly just for white people. Um, there are these anti-immigration undertones, and we've seen this elements of ecofascism in manifestos of attackers in Christchurch and El Paso and elsewhere. And I think there's also the potential for overlap with other motivations, including individuals opposed to a grab bag of issues such as urbanization, capitalism, consumerism, modernization, industrialization, and an aversion to creeping technology. The threat will remain diverse and it will remain fragmented. One of the quotes that always sticks with me was an interview I was doing with a retired senior member of British intelligence a few years ago, and he said, "Nothing ever falls off the plate." And what he meant about that was we have these new threats. We have, all of these grab bag of different ideologies, but the old ones have never gone away, right? So Al Qaeda is weakened, but they're still there. ISIS looks different, but it's still there. It's not like we've cleared these threats as others have slid on. They're all there at the same time, and it's difficult to know how to allocate resources to deal with which threat. Technology is going to continue to be a force multiplier. Virtual currencies, encrypted platforms, 3D printing, artificial intelligence, unmanned aerial systems or drones. These all of these technologies have lowered the barrier for entry for individuals wanting uh, to conduct terrorist attacks. Personally, I think we're going to see some kind of a terrorist attack in the United States using a drone within the next few years. I just feel like it's inevitable. Everybody has access to them. It's easy to do. Um, and even if the attack doesn't result in high lethality, right? Let's say it's somebody that just takes a crude quadcopter, straps on some explosives or some some easily accessible chemicals like chlorine and flies it into a crowd, whether that's a stadium, New Year's Eve gathering, farmers market, it doesn't matter. Um, don't forget, a big part of terrorism is psychological. It's to instill fear. Um, if the body count is high, that's a bonus for these folks, but it's by and large a psychological endeavor. So the terrorism threat is far from static. When a group suffers setbacks, including leadership decapitation, it rarely means the end of these groups. These groups go through several iterations before surging back. We've also seen a rash of lone state or of lone actors or lone wolves. And then they've become force multipliers with technology, with access to tech. Um, these days, organizational structure is less of an issue. These aren't groups that are all hierarchical or rigid. In fact, many are connected by the internet. They're decentralized, and they're able to kind of take advantage of the trappings of globalization, including transportation and communications, to make the world seem like a smaller place. Concerns I have with the U.S. pivoting away from counterterrorism and toward great power competition, we're inevitably going to miss something. Um, I've seen it firsthand when I go to Washington and go to the Pentagon that the bench is indeed thin when it comes to counterterrorism expertise. Um, and then lastly, I think in a worst case scenario, our over-reliance, our own over-reliance on technology, what we call over-the-horizon counterterrorism capabilities, end up making us vulnerable to another large-scale attack. So I hope that wasn't too much doom and gloom, but you know, I do pride myself on being nonpartisan, on being objective, on relying on data and empirical evidence, and trying to call balls and strikes. Um, these days, that's increasingly difficult with how partisan our country has become, how divided and polarized. But I can assure you, I have no political agenda. Um, you know, I critique everybody. I always say I'm an equal opportunity hater. My job, as I see it, is to keep Americans safe, not Democrats or Republicans, but Americans. And so I think one of the great dangers we face is politicizing counterterrorism. Shouldn't be a political endeavor. With that, happy to conclude my remarks and open it up to the crowd for Q&A. Thank you very much for your attention today. Look forward to talking further.
Great presentation.
Try the other one.
We are. No.
Try the other one.
Hello.
Try the other one.
See what we got here. How we doing? Thursday.
Can hear that better.
Hello? Yes. There we are. Great. Colin, thank you very much. As you said, we'll now do some Q&A. I'd really like to have some questions from the students amongst our luncheon group here now. So with that, we're going to continue the mic set in our technological room. Has established some rules regarding Q&A. I'll hold the mic, one question per person. And with that, let's go. Who's got the first one? Quick, hands up. Okay, very good. I'm going to come over here to Randy Newham of Penn State Berks, a board member of World Affairs. Kick us off.
Thank you, Dave. I know that President Trump says he's taking a very hard line against terrorism, but some of his actions have concerned me. And one of the big ones was announcing that we were going to cut embassies in a lot of African countries. And I think he tends to think, well, Africa is not a worthwhile area. I think he put it a little more bluntly than that. But given what you've said about Africa, what do you think about that, and what should we be doing in Africa?
Great question. You have to think wherever we're leaving a power vacuum, nature abhors a vacuum, and so it's being filled, and it's being filled by bad actors. At the very least, it's being filled by our adversaries, chiefly among them the Russians, but also the Chinese. The Chinese are a little bit more behind the scenes. They're mostly concerned about extractive resources and economics. The Russians are there for that, but also for politics. And I can guarantee you, because we have an ongoing project right now on Russian hybrid warfare, that the Russians do care about Africa. They are spending resources to gain and hold influence there. And it is a concern of mine, especially when you look at demographics. The future of young people, a lot of it's in Africa. There's a lot of emerging economies there. And so to completely marginalize an entire continent, right, because you think it's filled with shithole countries or whatever other derogatory comment the president has. And look, and I'm not a knee-jerk anti-Trump person. There's a lot that I disagree with, but there's other things that I have to give credence to. So I'm not somebody that's just going to come up here and give you, the garden variety partisan response. But I am critical of the administration's approach to Africa for sure. The other thing is, in September, when we had our global summit on terrorism and political violence, we had an African scholar named Pearl Matibe, and she said what worries her is everything that's happening in Africa that she's observing, particularly with these groups experimenting with drones. These things, I think she left us with, these are coming soon to a theater near you, meaning that the tactics, techniques, and procedures that these groups are experimenting with, in ungoverned spaces and fragile states, they hope to then bring to the West to conduct terrorist attacks. And so that's concerning to me.
Next question. Rodney, counting on you. Are you back there, Rodney Pearl, a regular attendee and a regular questioner?
If they made you counterterrorism czar, what things would you emphasize the most and which things might you de-emphasize a little bit or a lot?
It's a great,
Rodney.
that's a great question. I'm close with Chris Costa, who was the counterterrorism czar under Trump during his first administration. We're not close with the current person in that seat, who's a man named Sebastian Gorka. And we've tried to reach out and explain a few things. What would I do? Well, I would have never made drug cartels into foreign terrorist organizations. And we have a new paper on this. I think it's a bit of a sidebar, but there's a lot of dangers in reflagging criminal organizations as terrorist groups. That doesn't mean that I don't think these cartels are a threat. I do. and I think they're a threat to national security. But waging a military campaign divorced from any strategy is concerning to me because I think we could very well sleep into a conflict that we claim we want no part of. And so I'll say that. What else would I be doing that we're not doing now? I would be continuing to be very aggressive where ISIS poses the greatest threat, including in the Middle East, including in some parts of Africa, and including in Central Asia, in terms of utilizing our comparative advantage of technology, conducting drone strikes, breaking up some of these logistical networks that exist. Those would be a few things. And also, from a domestic terrorism standpoint, I would go to great lengths to depoliticize intelligence. So if you saw the president speak after the Charlie Kirk shooting, he listed off a number of attacks. He talked about the Steve Scalise shooting. The only ones he mentioned were attacks on the right by the left. He neglected to mention all the attacks on the left by the right. And so I don't think it's a good place when the president's saying we really only care about political violence when it's directed against our political opponents. That's a slippery slope to me.
Question here. What school are you from?
Muhlenberg High School.
See you.
Yes, I am a senior.
And your name?
Yelixa.
Ken.
Yelixa.
Okay, go ahead. I'll hold the mic. Question.
How can we defund these groups and or prevent the funding from other nations towards these groups?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll start with the how do we prevent other nations from funding them? One is sanctions, and we're doing that now. We're sanctioning Iran. Some of it, we're never going to be able to persuade the Chinese to stop buying cheap Iranian oil. It's just not going to happen. It's more of a mitigation strategy. In terms of going after these groups themselves, we have to be at the forefront of how they're making money, raising money, moving money, storing money. And that includes more resources for the Department of Treasury. And a big part of this is diplomacy, right? So how do we get information from our allies about where the threats are? I just, and again, here's a place where my views on the Trump administration are not just black and white, but a little bit more nuanced. I don't agree with the president publicly haranguing and browbeating our NATO allies to pay more. At the same time, they should pay more for their own defense. It's just the manner in which he's going about it is counterproductive in some ways. In other ways, he's gotten NATO allies to pay more, although I would chalk that more up to the very obvious threat from Russia. If you look what the Russians are doing, and we've done NATO a disservice, and NATO countries themselves should have been pulling their weight more. The president is right about that we have a free rider problem in NATO. But going about and very publicly shaming and embarrassing them can, while it may get them to pay more, it may cause friction with their governments, their policymakers, that leads to a bad relationship in other areas. Just in the last few days, we've seen that our actions and what we're doing in terms of drone strikes against boats in the Caribbean have caused the British to pull back on sharing intelligence with us because they're concerned about the legality of who we're killing there, and the Colombians as well, who say that this lack of transparency in sharing how we know who's on these boats and what these boats are bringing has caused them to pull back because some Colombian nationals have been killed, who they claim are fishermen.
Should Saul Lausch up front? Saul is also a board member. And he, along with Lynn Brown, really do a lot of our educational interface with students, etc. So,
Yeah. Could you go back to Syria for just a moment and your take on al-Shahara? And the parallel, just to ask you this, for me, I see a parallel with the way Malcolm Reagan was perceived by the British in the late 1940s.
Sure.
He was designated as a terrorist.
Yep.
And was charged with some actual murders in that time. Is there a parallel here, and are we right, at least in trying to give al-Shahara some sort of break here and see if he is sincere about reapproachment?
There is a parallel, and I think there's a parallel you could extend to Nelson Mandela, who at one point was the head of the African National Congress, or Jerry Adams, the one-time alleged head of the Provisional Irish Republican Army, who then went to join Sinn Féin, and be quite successful in the polls. So there are historical examples, right? Go back to one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. A bit of a cliche, but it comes from somewhere. In terms of are we right to give him a chance? It's a big gamble, but it seems like he does want to do the right thing. He's saying the right things. His actions are aligning with what he's saying. Um, the hard part for me to swallow is this is somebody that likely has American blood on his hands. This is someone that spent time in Camp Bucca. This is somebody that was a one-time confidant of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And so if you can get over that, and it's a lot to get over, and some people can't. And I know, when I talk to my Israeli friends, they think we're foolish. They think we're being duped. They say he's a sheep in wolf's or a wolf in sheep's clothing. But 2 years out from October 7th, I think they don't trust anybody. Uh, it could work. It's a gambit that could work if we give al-Shar the resources that are needed to succeed. And when I hear people say that we're crazy for doing it, I ask them what the alternative is, and they don't have many good answers. So it's a gamble, but it's one that could pay off. Um, if again, it's just, I'm still trying to get over the video I saw of him playing basketball with CENTCOM commander and being in the office joking with the president. So, uh, yeah, I'm hopeful, and I have some colleagues that are probably a lot more optimistic than I am, including individuals that are close friends of mine that have recently engaged with him and were invited, American citizens that were invited to meet him in Damascus, including Jewish Americans, right? That would think about how that would have been unheard of at a certain point, that you have Jewish American scholars going to Damascus to meet with the former head of Jabhat al-Nusra or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. So. Um, I'm guarded, but I think this could work. I'm also concerned that this is somebody that's made a lot of enemies, and that he could be assassinated, and that could plunge the country back into civil war and sectarian strife. I don't think that's out of the question.
Sure.
Hi, David Sachs. It seems to me that support for terrorism at the grassroots comes from a population that has anger, despair, hopelessness, and really no place else to turn. And as a country and as a world, we seem to fail at addressing those fundamental issues. In the absence of addressing those issues, fighting terrorism seems to be a game of whack-a-mole. So how can we have a successful fight against terrorism, given those fundamental issues that will always have fertile ground for terrorism among those who feel disenfranchised?
That's a great question. I'll go back to my comment earlier, which is you can never completely defeat a tactic, right? You mentioned people that were largely dispossessed and their grievances stem from socioeconomic issues. But there's a great book by a scholar named Diego Gambetta called Engineers of Jihad, and it talks about people that actually were very educated, very well respected in society, and went on to form the core and the nucleus of groups like Al Qaeda. Ayman al-Zawahiri, the number two to bin Laden for a long time, was a medical doctor. Bin Laden himself was quite wealthy and from a wealthy background. And so if we start trying to assuage everybody's grievance about everything, well, we're going to run out of resources pretty quickly. You have to figure out where our finite resources are best served. I do think completely gutting USAID is going to prove to be more than just a bit myopic and a bit of an own goal, as they say, because of the loss of soft power, because of the loss of access, ability to project influence, and ability to mollify some of those grievances, which you just mentioned. And if we're not doing it, who is? Either nobody and the situation's getting worse, or maybe the Chinese are, and maybe in 10 years, um, we have a very different perception of the world. I still don't want to be living in a world ruled by Beijing. I don't think that's the superpower I'm looking for. And I don't think many others are either. But when left with no options, they're going to turn to the place that is able to provide, you know, food and economic aid and healthcare.
And can the Western world do to address the concerns of the Muslim community across the world, that indeed the Western world is anti-Muslim?
I think, look, again, I'm raising a 7 and a 9-year-old, so treat others like you want to be treated. If we say that we're not Islamophobic, don't be Islamophobic, right? I mean, look at the things. If you look at the New York City mayoral race, I was in New York a couple of weeks ago to receive an award from my alma mater, NYU, and just being in the hotel room, the commercials that were playing, they had Zoran Mamdani standing in front of the Trade Center, superimposed as the planes crashed into it, linking somebody that's 31 years old with an attack he had nothing to do with. That was Islamophobic, blatantly. So, but it's acceptable, and it's, people say, well, the things that I saw about, now you could not like him for a whole number of reasons, and you can be against his economic policies. But to kind of try to tie him to an Al Qaeda attack just to me is blatant Islamophobia. So I think we have to live our values, right? If we say um, we're about democracy and human rights, then we have to be about that. I think that's what really gets people is the hypocrisy when we say we're doing one thing, but we're actually doing another. And it bothers me too as an American.
Question from a student at Penn State. Student in trying to get into international relations, I think. Your name, please?
Trainer.
Go ahead, Betty.
I have a question about some issues about domestic terrorism. A lot of the ideologies that kind of breed these violent attacks, things like incels, eco-fascists, neo-Nazis, they kind of find like a safe haven in the internet, and they're not easily controlled by laws and the government and like counterterrorism. Is there a way that we as a culture or as a government can kind of cycle these ideas out of consciousness, or do we kind of have to meet them where they are and kind of just fight them?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that the government should be in the idea in the business of telling people how to think and what to think. Maybe that's something that starts from civil society and from our own communities. If you've ever heard the famous trope, "Hi, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you." We're a country with a large culture of kind of anti-government streak, right? The whole Gadsden flag and not wanting the government to overstep or encroach uh, so I think there's some of that. The other part is these platforms are owned by tech companies. They're not owned by the government. So with First Amendment rights, the fact that these are held by the private sector, which have very little incentive to moderate any kind of content on their platform. And even when they tell you they do it half-assed. I've been in those conversations. You know, I've had a lot of people come to me saying that basically in despair over the state of the country. And this dovetails. I promise you, there's a point here. I'm 45 years old, so I was born in 1980. Uh, you know, take that for what it's worth. But I agree. In my lifetime, this is probably the most divided I've ever seen our country. And when a country's divided, um, I always say people are anxious, they're angry, and in the United States, many of them are well armed. That's a bad combination. Um, when people feel helpless and they say, like, what do you do? The advice might be corny, but I focus on what I can control, which is being a good husband, being a good father, being a good neighbor, a good colleague, talking to people who I don't agree with politically, right? You don't even have to talk about politics, but at a certain point, we stop getting to know our neighbors. And there's a great book that many of you probably know called Bowling Alone, by a Harvard sociologist named Robert Putnam, and he put his finger on something. Um, he refers to it as social capital, but when he looks at going all the way back to de Tocqueville, what made our country so great, um, a lot of that's gone, right? So, I don't want to misrepresent his argument, but for me, and I thought a lot about this during COVID, what it boiled down to was nowadays, you guys are sitting in Reading, PA, right? You may have more in common with some gamer in Seoul, South Korea, but you don't even know who your neighbor is, right? We've all retreated to our little corners and our foxholes. Um, and he takes the name bowling alone from bowling leagues, which used to be more common. And he talks about the PTA and coaching Little League and doing all these things. So even though my wife and I, and she's a nurse at University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, even though we both have busy careers and we're raising two kids, we still try to go out of our way to do a lot in our community, to coach, to mentor. Mentorship something I take really seriously, and I have for a long time, and to kind of put your money where your mouth is. Do you have skin in the game or not? And I think if everybody thought like that and we did more, and worked across the aisle, and it's not about Democrats or Republicans, um, I think we'd make a lot of progress on that stuff, right? But I think we've also just accepted the vile and the crass as ordinary, right? And so when people are saying crazy things online, we just kind of shrug, right? Where we should be appalled and we should call out that type of behavior. Um, but, solving racism on the internet, I think, is a topic for another day, and I'll let another speaker take a stab at that.
There you come. Another question. Uh, let me take this moment then to interject. To what extent are terrorist groups banding together to support one another, kind of regardless of the topic? An echo terrorist group supporting a Muslim group simply because they're terrorists. And if that's happening, what extent is it happening? And if it grows, where does that go to?
Um, it's rare. You rarely see cooperation between terrorist groups, particularly with different ideologies. You see some of it. So the Axis of Resistance is a great example where Hezbollah had trained Hamas. Um, you know, each trained other groups. It was kind of what we call a train the trainer model. You also see what we call the crime terror nexus, where you have cooperation between criminals and terrorist groups. But you rarely see kind of cross ideological cooperation between terrorist groups. And there's a lot of reasons for that: lack of trust, opening yourself up to who this person really is, right? This person claims to be a member of the FARC, but are they really undercover DEA? And so we see less and less of that. There is a good book by a scholar named Asaf Moghadam, who's a visiting professor at Georgetown University this semester, a good friend of mine. It's called The Nexus of Global Jihad, and he talks about examples of groups cooperating for anybody that's interested. I think that's Columbia University as well. Book.
Colin, any last question? Oops, hold on a second. One more from Rodney. And then I think Lynn will be ready to wrap her up.
Yeah, hopefully. You have been emphasizing terrorists by small groups primarily and by state-sponsored groups. But what about when the state itself, who's a major power, say Russia and Ukraine, is using terrorism as a tactic? What thoughts do you have on that?
So we're limited in the United States by we have an actual list of state sponsors of terrorism. Iran is on it. I think Syria was on it under Assad. They may have been removed. Cuba is on it. North Korea is on it. Um, Russia's not. Pakistan's not. Sudan was, but when Sudan agreed to take part in the Abraham Accords and normalize relations with Israel, we removed Sudan from the state sponsor of terrorism list. And my question at the time was, so wait, were they never a state sponsor of terrorism? Or did they just stop being so because they did something we wanted them to do politically? the whole list is inherently political, which is why Cuba is still on there. Anybody worried about Cuban-inspired terrorism? I'm not. I'm worried about Russian-backed terrorism. I'm worried about the Pakistanis, using proxy groups to attack India. I'm less concerned about the Cubans. So until we get serious about depoliticizing that list, there's only so much we could do there. We should have the Russians on that list because they are sponsoring terrorism. And again, terrorism is a tactic, right? But when it's somebody that we back, we don't really call it terrorism, right? And when it's somebody we oppose, we say, well, that's a terrorist group.
Yeah.
A lot of times we'll call them rebels if we're either agnostic or we're in favor of what they're doing.
Okay, Colin, thank you so much for your thought-provoking presentation.
Thank you for having me.
A lot to think about, a lot to unpack, and we do see you frequently on TV. So we're very pleased that you're taking that message to as many people as you possibly can. We have a gift for you that we're mailing to you. It's a token of our appreciation. It's a plate that talks about the World Affairs Council, and it has a Pennsylvania Dutch depiction, which is our
Thank you so
heritage
much.
here.
Thank
So
you.
we're thrilled and we're so grateful for your time with us today.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. And I think what you're doing here today, all meeting together and talking about these issues, is exactly part of the antidote that I described. And I hope more take, look at this model and have greater participation in their own communities, because this is helping, whether you think it or not, but it really is.
Thank you for that. I agree. And I think everyone in this audience agrees with you very much.